Welcome to the Filmlings Podcast,
a bi-weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 52, The HITCH-HIKE, The Women.
That's right, part 2 of our Hitchcock series. This time we're going to be talking all about the women in his films, and they appeared in quite a variety of manners. An interesting point in history to talk about the treatment of women in media, and an interesting director to talk about the treatment of women in media in particular.
Yeah, there has been much ink spilled over the the female characters in Hitchcock films, and about his interactions with women on and off set. And so we are going to accent that with some hot air on this podcast. But just the three that we've picked, because women obviously feature very heavily in all of his films, and this conversation is going to continue in the subsequent episodes of the podcast, because we're going to be covering movies like Vertigo and Psycho that have really heavy implications where the women are concerned. But the three that we've picked for this week specifically we're starting with Spellbound from 1945, starring Ingrid Bergman and Gregory Peck. And that film won the Best Musical Score at the Oscars, and it's based on a book, as many of Hitchcock's films are. And the book was called The House of Dr. Edwards.
Yeah, Hitchcock was not known as a big writer, and a lot of his stories ended up being based off of pre-existing stories such as books or more books. But anyway, the second one we're going to talk about today is The Birds from 1963, perhaps one of the strangest Hitchcock films. It was nominated for Best Special Effects at the Oscars, and it was also based on a book of the same name, The Birds, by Daphne du Maurier.
Yeah, that film stars Tippi Hedren and Rod Taylor, and our last film also stars Tippi Hedren, and that is Marnie from the next year, 1964, starring again Tippi Hedren and Sean Connery, and that is based on a book of the same name by Winston Graham, and that shows two very different sides of Tippi Hedren's acting performance, which was amazing. She was definitely a breakout in The Birds, and we'll talk about that.
All right, so let's dive into our movies for today. And the first one up on the docket is Spellbound from 1945. And that is a movie kind of about spells, but more about psychology. And it centers around a female psychologist played by Ingrid Bergman at a remote psychology facility. I guess you might call it a asylum of sorts, maybe, up in Vermont, somewhere on the East Coast, out of the way of most cities. And their head guy is retiring. There's going to be a new head psychologist coming in, and this guy shows up, and he's just very strange. He seems off, but he has an immediate connection with Ingrid Bergman's character. The two get along, they flirt, they kind of start dating in a way, in like a 1940s sense of the word date.
I think they literally go on a picnic.
They literally go on a picnic. I don't know if that qualifies as a date or not. I don't know. I don't want to get into that conversation. But after they kind of fall for each other, she starts to notice these strange things about him. He'll freak out at odd times. Once when she draws these parallel lines with her fork and a tablecloth, he freaks out. Once when he sees the parallel lines on her nightgown, he freaks out. And eventually comes out that his memory has some holes in it. And then eventually it comes out that he's not who he thinks he is. He has a case of amnesia, and he's just impersonating this doctor. And suddenly the news breaks that this doctor has been found dead. And so this guy believes that he's the one who killed the doctor, being a patient of the doctor, in his past forgotten life that he no longer remembers, and goes into a bit of a guilt complex, which is a theme they set up all throughout the film. There's a lot of psychology repeatedly in the film. There's a lot of psychology, a lot of dream interpretation and desire interpretation, and I don't know how much of it, if any of it, is accurate. reading psychology articles on Wikipedia didn't seem like a very interesting thing to research this week when we're researching Hitchcock movies. But I think
they
the point
definitely
of it
feel
is,
like MacGuffins, like just kind of empty plot devices.
yeah. The point is you don't need to know whether or not it's right. Like maybe if you're a psych major or a psychologist or a psychotherapist and you're watching a movie like this, then it would upset you. And I totally understand that. But for the majority of us who don't understand that branch of science at all, then it works. It serves the plot well, and it's interesting and fascinating and leads to some very interesting dream interpretation scenes, which we will have cause to talk about at length here in a little while. So both Ingrid Bergman and Gregory Peck end up on the run from the cops. Gregory Peck runs away first, then Ingrid Bergman has to chase after him, and they catch up, they meet up, they end up on the run together, and they decide to stick with it and figure out this puzzling mystery, and that mystery of like how he's connected to this murder is kind of like the central question of the plot, the question of the story, the question of the movie. Especially because he believes he was the one who did it, and Ingrid Bergman believes that there's no way this guy could have done it, which might be, those rose-colored glasses she has on because she's fallen in love with this guy.
Definitely. And they actually bring that up like explicitly in the movie.
Oh, yeah, that's definitely part of it. I mean, it's a movie full of psychologists. They're definitely going to bring that
right
up. And they end up going and finding the mentor of Ingrid Bergman's character, this old guy who kind of actually does look like Freud.
Yeah, he was very well make-upped to be a psychiatrist.
Yes, like the old pipe-smoking, big beard, Germanic psychologist, that type. I think he even has a German accent.
Yeah.
But anyway, they go to him for help, and I think I'm going to leave off with the plot there, because that's when they start to really unpack all of these mysteries that have been building up. What's his connection? What's his deal with guilt complexes? What's his deal with parallel lines that have been happening all throughout the movie?
And
why
the
do
color
they freak
white.
him out so much? The color white. And then all of this is kind of culminates in this big dream sequence that was just wonderful and maybe the weirdest thing I've ever seen in a Hitchcock movie. And Jonathan, why is it the weirdest thing we've ever seen in a Hitchcock movie?
Because this dream sequence was art directed by Salvador Dali, our old friend from back in our Louis Buñuel week, who helped with the film Un Chien Andalou, one of the strangest films ever made, because it's literal surrealism and the beginning of surrealism in film. And every time Dali has a collaboration with filmmakers from then, he incorporates little elements of that. So, for example, we see, actually the first thing we see when we go into the dream sequence is this curtain full of these eyeballs. And we kind of actually start by flying through some eyeballs, almost like in this frame full of eyeballs, like we saw in Metropolis during the dancing sequence. And then we see this curtain with all these eye shapes, and this man comes through with a gigantic, like unnecessarily enormous pair of scissors and cuts right through the middle of the eyeball, like another eyeball slicing moment that we saw in Un Chien Andalou, but much less graphic. And then, yeah, from there, it's just like these series of images, like these giant poker cards that are blank, and this guy with a mask on and a wheel, and these very angular, like strange geography and stuff like that. And one of the actually interesting things that Hitchcock talks about this sequence, I think it was in his interview with Francois Truffaut, which is a very extensive interview that was turned into a book called Hitchcock. But anyway, he says that when he was making this dream sequence, the main thing that he wanted to get away from was this idea of dream sequences that are all like smoky and misty and blurry, and you can't really see, which, kind of makes sense because of the way that we remember dreams as not totally clear and all that. But he wanted to reverse that, and actually he says that the dream sequence is almost the sharpest part in the picture, and he picked Salvador Dali because of his use of hard lines and very striking and contrasty geography and stuff like that. So that was definitely one of the highlights of the film, and you can find many just like reproductions of that scene on YouTube, because it's so interesting. And so like, even out of all of the dream sequences in Hitchcock films, which there are many, this one really stands out just for how surreal it is.
Yeah. And there's a number of camera tricks that are used throughout the dream sequence just to make it work. So it's interesting from that perspective. And it is still very abstract in a very different way than, a cloud of fog. I thought it was funny, even when there was before the first time I saw this dream sequence, I didn't know Dali had worked on it. So I was watching through it, and there's this point where, metaphorically speaking, it's supposed to be a man who's just shot somebody and he's holding a revolver. But in the dream, it doesn't appear as a revolver. It appears as a wheel. But it's like one of those really melty wheels that looked like it's been put into the microwave for a while out of a Dali painting. And I was watching it the first time not knowing that it was Dali. And I was like, that kind of looks like it was from a Dali painting. Maybe this was influenced by Salvador Dali. And then I go and look it up, and I'm like, it was influenced by Salvador Dali, but, much more directly than I thought it was.
Yeah, and actually one of the other things Hitchcock told Truffaut about was, he was like, Dali wanted lots of crazy things in this. He wanted this statue to crack, and then all of these ants to pour out of it. And then inside the statue, we see Ingrid Bergman, the main character, the lead actress, covered in ants and stuff like that. And that's exactly what we saw again in Un Chien Andalou, with the ants coming out of the hand. And that's an image that he used, Dali used in his collaboration with Walt Disney and Destino, which you can find on YouTube. And so it's like Dali was definitely operating firing on all surrealist cylinders for this.
Yeah, what's up with this guy and ants? Whew.
I don't know. He must have had a bad experience.
Yeah. I can imagine the conversations that led to Ingrid Bergman not being covered in ants.
Right.
Yeah. But speaking of Ingrid Bergman, I do want to talk about the lead roles in this film, because they are kind of the exact opposite of what you typically see in a film from the 1940s. Ingrid Bergman plays the protagonist, plays the hero. She's smart. She's well put together. She's not interested in romance at the beginning of the film. And then here comes this attractive, swooning, and very much damsel in distress, just a male, in Gregory Peck. And she falls for him and decides to help him. But that's like a complete flip-flop of the typical gender roles you would see in a movie of this time period. And especially coming out of a Hitchcock movie, that's incredibly interesting, because whether or not it's actually true, I've never met the guy, but he doesn't have the best reputation when it comes to interacting with women.
Yeah, and some of that may be exaggerated, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the character interactions, like you're saying, they are kind of uncharacteristic for the time period. There's actually like the fact that it's a woman in a predominantly male occupation, especially at the time period. So she's just at the beginning surrounded by all of these male psychologists, and like he plays up this contrast to the maximum, where all the other male psychologists are kind of like teasing her and gossiping about her, and one of them is like unashamedly has a crush on her. He like kisses her within our first 5 minutes of knowing either of them, and she just kind of plays it off, and they have this kind of play back and forth. But it was like it was very much kind of commenting on the way that males interact with females in their work environment. And it's like you were saying at the top of this episode, it's kind of a lot of that conversation happening right now. But then the interesting thing is that she kind of subverts all the things that she stands for at the very beginning, where she's like, yeah, no, I want to focus on my work and all this. And psychologists are the running gag is that a woman is the best psychologist until she falls in love, and then she's the best patient. And that's exactly what happens. As soon as she falls for Gregory Peck, she just becomes a basket case and is just like, will stop at nothing until he's freed. Like, she doesn't entertain the possibility that he could be guilty. Like, I didn't know that she thought that anyone could be guilty until the very end when we find out who did it. Because it's just like, anytime that someone presents something that they think they did, she's like, oh no, you didn't do that. You just think you did that. And it got a little tiring after a while, but that's, Hitchcock is less interested in the content of the material a lot of times as he is in creating the suspense in certain moments and across his film.
Yeah. And it is fascinating because you're right. It's the opposite of a male hero being derailed by like a film, a male hero's life being derailed by a femme fatale. Like basically the opposite happens in this movie. And it's interesting to watch, and it's not super overt either. Like, aside from the one or two comments you mentioned about the psychologist saying a woman is the best psychologist until she falls in love, there's no talk about like how she has to be the only woman in the workplace or something along those lines. You get the sense that that's part of her character, and it comes across in her performance, but it isn't super overt because I think that would derail this particular movie because that's not what the movie's
it's not
really
pushing
about.
A message. It just kind of has it ingrained in the way that the characters interact. Yeah.
It's just kind of like a matter of fact for the world that the story takes place in, and it lets it impact the story without taking over the story, because the story of the film is a mystery. It's a suspense. A story about whether or not this guy actually killed his doctor, and if he didn't kill him, then why does he remember killing his doctor or think he remembers killing his doctor? And that's the mystery that our hero has to solve over the course of the film, and that does hold up as the main story, the main thing you remember about the movie, other than like that dream sequence.
Yeah, and along those lines, one of the interesting things about this movie, going back to last week, is that it's basically a wrong man story, but it has a really interesting twist on it in that he is the one who thinks that he killed the doctor, who he didn't kill. So he is his own wrong man, which is really interesting to put those two into the same character, and instead of the woman that he gets metaphorically handcuffed to, thinking that he's wrong and she's forced to be with him, she's the only one who thinks that he is right and or that he's innocent, and she follows him. So yeah, it's just a really interesting dynamic, one that I haven't even seen in a lot of other films. It's not something that you see a lot anymore, where a character thinks that they did something that they didn't do, and they spend the whole time like trying to figure out if they're innocent, let alone prove their innocence.
Yeah, if anything, it's the opposite. Like a character did something bad, or and then finds out that they were the one who did something bad. I'm thinking like Memento, Fight Club, so on and so forth. That tends to be the direction it goes recently. But yeah, you're right. It's the exact opposite with the wrong man twist in this movie. And again, this week we see Hitchcock using motifs, and I would almost call it a MacGuffin, but it's not really. The parallel lines that are used throughout the film to kind of, well, literally they trigger Gregory Peck's character, and he like goes into a weird trance and freaks out when he sees them. Quick spoiler alert, spoiler warning in case you haven't seen the movie, but the parallel lines are significant. They represent the two parallel lines skis make in the snow. It related to the skiing incident that is at the root of all of his memory problems going on throughout the film. But
honestly, can I just
yeah, sure, go for it.
Honestly, the way that they get to that conclusion, they have to take a couple like Batman 66 logical leaps in order to figure that part out.
Yeah, no. That's why the psychology in this film seems so sketchy to me. It feels really sketchy and like movie psychology, but I don't care because I know it's movie psychology. Like
Yeah.
this isn't supposed to be subtle cinema verite, realistic storytelling going on here. This is heightened reality, golden age movie storytelling going on. So the mumbo jumbo psychology that makes sense for the plot to make sense is fine by me. But anyway, yeah, we see these lines repeating again and again, kind of like I talked about the last time on the podcast with the grid patterns in North by Northwest. Except that was just a visual motif, and this is actually a key point of the plot and a key point of the story are these parallel lines. And unlike a MacGuffin, this is just an actual clue because it's actually significant to the plot. The meaning of the lines is significant. Now, if the lines didn't have meaning and they were just something that propelled the plot forward, that would be a MacGuffin. But since they actually mean something, they're a significant clue at the end of the day. And before we move on, I should mention that Ingrid Bergman would do 2 other movies with Alfred Hitchcock: the wonderful film Notorious with Cary Grant and Alfred Hitchcock, and then Under Capricorn, which I haven't seen, and I've seen a lot of Hitchcock movies, but I just haven't seen Under Capricorn.
Yeah, and a couple other things I just wanted to touch on about this movie that are really interesting are some of the, again, like motifs, like you were saying, but there's one specific moment when Gregory Peck and Ingrid Bergman kiss for the first time, and she kind of admits that she loves him while she's saying that her care for him has nothing to do with love. It's purely professional. But in that moment, we fade to this shot of like a series of 7 or 8 doors opening, and the camera tracks through them a little bit, and it's very symbolic and almost suggestive in the way that the ending of North by Northwest with the train going through the tunnel is.
The tunnel.
But yeah, that's interesting that he puts that, like, he just kind of slaps it right in the middle of the film. Like, he doesn't even care that he's like, this is a symbol. I'm just going to show it to you because it shows that she's opening up. She's falling in love with him. And then the other thing that's not a motif or a symbol, but it's just a really kind of interesting shot that Hitchcock uses here that I don't know of another time that he does this, is the very end. We see the shot of a gun tracking Ingrid Bergman, but it's from a first person point of view of the person holding the gun, and then it turns around. And there is also the fact that we didn't mention this, but the film is 99.99% black and white, except for like one frame near the very end, which is also a very interesting thing that, again, I have not seen in anything since or before this movie.
Yeah, it's always interesting to track those things, and realize how unique this 1940s movie is. Some of those things that you wouldn't expect to see until the French New Wave and all those new waves of the mid-century rolled around. But a lot of people tend to forget that the French New Wave was in large part inspired by filmmakers like Alfred Hitchcock, and specifically Alfred Hitchcock. I mean,
right.
You talked about how Truffaut literally spent a week interviewing Hitchcock and wrote a whole book about it. But we don't have time to discuss that whole book today. We'll leave that for the birds. So, Jonathan, why don't you introduce our next movie for us?
Yes, The Birds from 1963, proof that nobody is above making a monster movie, honestly, because this is Hitchcock's monster movie, discounting all of his human monsters like in Psycho and stuff like that. So The Birds follows a woman, a very rich kind of society woman named Melody Daniels, played by Tippi Hedren. And we open with her going to a bird shop to pick up some birds that she ordered or something that have not arrived yet. And she runs into a man there, Mitch Brenner, played by Rod Taylor, who kind of plays some mind games with her because he's a lawyer, and he had seen her in court because she is kind of known as this practical jokester, and one of her jokes had broken a window, and so it had this little legal proceeding. Anyway, after this interaction, she basically stalks him and figures out where he lives, and she follows him to his mother's home in Bodega Bay, where he's staying with his mom and his sister. And as she goes through this whole series of things, she brings him these lovebirds, which is really actually an interesting thing that Hitchcock does. Like, the lovebirds they're just birds, but the fact that they're called lovebirds, just the word love, every time it's used, like, it kind of perks everyone up to this idea that she's crushing on him or pursuing him in some way, which is true, but it's not as blatant at first. And that word just kind of helps put that idea in our mind.
It's a very deliberate species of bird to pick.
Yeah. But as she is taking these birds to him, she, in one instance, is attacked by a bird as she's rowing across a lake, and a series of other bird attacks start to descend upon this town of Bodega Bay. And so we're starting with this story of Melanie Daniels and how she's trying to win over this man and her mother, who is jealous after his father died. But really, it all kind of takes a backseat, because anytime we get too involved in the personal stuff, these bird attacks happen, and it just turns into this apocalyptic nightmare by the end, where everyone, whether they like each other or not, are kind of in this thing together trying to just survive. And that is not the kind of plot pitch that I would expect to be giving for a Hitchcock movie. But this is one of his great films. And, again, it is proof that, genre films should not be relegated to some other section of filmmaking. Because if Alfred Hitchcock, the master of suspense, can make a movie about birds just attacking people randomly and never explain it, then anyone can make a monster movie. But real quick, the cameo is, again, this is later in the career, so it's pretty early in the movie. He is leaving one of the shops as Tippi Hedren is going in to get her birds, and he is walking two terriers. Oh, his own terriers.
Yes, his own terriers. Those are his own terriers.
All right. Well, there you go. And actually, I was watching this with my wife, and she just saw the dogs, and she didn't even notice that it was Alfred Hitchcock until I pointed him out.
Hey, no, I totally respect that. Recognize the dogs before you recognize the people.
Okay, so the first thing we should probably talk about is our leading lady in this film, Tippi Hedren, who is famous for this film and our next film, Marnie, but did not do a whole lot after this, although she is really incredible in both of these films, this being her first feature film role after Alfred Hitchcock saw her in an advertisement, and I think he had wanted another actress for this movie who ended up not being able to do it. But he saw her in this advertisement and called people and basically got her to do an audition. And she, when she was getting all this news that she was wanted by this director for a movie, she was never told who it was. And then all of a sudden it was Alfred Hitchcock, and oh my gosh. So he kind of picked her out and showed her the role and all this stuff, and basically turned her into one of the iconic blondes that, he's always got a blonde featuring a very prominent role. And, this, even the fact that the first time that she's attacked, she gets attacked on the head. And so focus is almost brought to her hair at the beginning of this tragedy is very interesting. But this is a very different role than we'll see in Marnie. Her kind of character arc for this film is starting off as, again, very posh, kind of rich and girlish, where she does all these pranks, and there's all this tabloid news about her, and she's kind of silly. And, the fact that she would follow this guy to this random place where he lives just to bring him these lovebirds is really elaborate and kind of out of the way, but she has money and time, so she can do that kind of thing. And then as we go through these series of tragic incidents, she basically gets brought down to a human level where she can empathize and interact with other people at a normal level. And, when you're being attacked by birds that are like literally swarming in the hundreds, how much money you have doesn't really matter at that point.
Yeah, it's a pretty level playing field.
Uh-huh.
And we should also talk about the brunette in the movie, or brunettes, I should say, plural.
Right.
Just from like a color standpoint, maybe because that's what I do for a living. But aside from whatever opinions Alfred Hitchcock had on the stereotypes and tropes that are associated with blondes, just from a visual standpoint, it's going to be much easier to cast a whole set of brunettes and have your leading actress be a blonde, and then she really stands out from the rest of the cast. Then vice versa, have one brunette among like a million blondes. I'm not saying it's impossible either way, but blonde hair is definitely rare. And visually, either one works to make one stand out. And that is what Hitchcock tended to go with. And it's definitely what he went with in this film. Once we get into the brunette-haired characters who are actually characters and not just background extras, the schoolhouse teacher in Bodega Bay, the town we're in for this movie, actually also came from San Francisco, much like our leading lady Tippi Hedren did in the film, and much in the same way. She was chasing after Mitch, played by Rod Taylor, in this film. But her suit of him did not go as expected. And in a lot of ways, she is kind of set up as a rival to Tippi Hedren. But in a lot of ways, she's just kind of this mirror to Tippi Hedren of like a woman in a similar situation who failed in her attempt to essentially marry Mitch. And she failed in that attempt because of another one of the female tropes we see often in Alfred Hitchcock movies. Actually, almost all of them. Spellbound is unique in that it doesn't have one. There are a few others that don't have it, but most of them do, and that is the mother character. And this is the part that does actually get into Freudian psychology.
Right, even though it's not blatant in this one.
Yeah. I think maybe the strongest, the most famous example is Psycho. And it's not to the level of Psycho in this one, but it is an odd relationship. And that is the relationship between Mitch and his mom in this movie. He lives in San Francisco during the week, but he comes back to Bodega Bay on the weekends and spends time there with his mom and his sister, who is still school age. She's like a preteen, 12, 13-ish, somewhere in there.
Yeah, that was kind of... I kept thinking about that the whole time, like trying to do all the numbers on that, and I just gave up at some point.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't worry about it. Don't think about it too much. I mean, it's not a problem either way. It's just a very interesting situation to have two children spaced out that much and you wonder about it. So that's natural. But anyway, a few years ago, apparently, I don't know if they specified how much time, Mitch's father passed away. And ever since then, Mitch's mom has been keeping Mitch very close. And essentially, he's functioning in his family, and especially to his mother, as a stand-in for his father. Platonically, of course. There's no like incest in this movie, but the relationship can sometimes feel like that. It feels like she is relying on Mitch for his strength, like she used to rely on her husband for his strength. And she repeatedly says throughout the movie that she was a stronger person. And they end up having a very direct confrontation about it, her and Tippi Hedren, over the course of the movie, about the role they have towards each other and towards Mitch.
That's actually one of the most interesting things about this movie to me and these female characters, because, like you're saying, they like address all these things that we're talking about like super directly. Even Tippi Hedren's character and the school teacher character, because Tippi Hedren ends up staying with her. The school teacher has a room for rent, and basically they have this whole conversation. They say, yeah, no, his mom is clingy. Like, oh no, I don't know if she's clingy, but she's definitely got this kind of weird vibe going on. And they like talk through all the things that you're already thinking about what this relationship is. And so he's very direct about it. Like, you know, he's not kind of just slipping this in there. He's addressing it. He's having his characters talk through it. And that's that interaction between Tippy and the school teacher. Again, the blonde and the darker haired quote unquote rival character, because in a way she would have been a rival like several years ago, but at this point she's basically given up on having Mitch. But there's still, that still presents this tension. And then when they start living together for a couple of days, all of these dynamics are thrown together, and it kind of informs all of their interactions together, even though it's all very civil and polite. Like, there's so many layers of emotion under everything that they're saying that's really interesting. And again, with the mother also, the mother knows that she's a little overbearing and kind of jealous of her son, and she's trying to fix that in herself, and you can kind of sense that struggle. And so, putting all of those character dynamics are interesting in themselves, but you add on top of that this idea of birds literally dive bombing people as soon as they step out of their house, and you have a really, really interesting and eventually Hitchcockian film.
Yeah, and you know what's weird? And I didn't realize this the first time I watched the movie. I realized it the second time I watched the movie, and it gives, I think it's part of what gives all of these interactions like this really odd, almost very direct feel, is that there's like no score in this movie. There's almost none. It's very minimal. Yeah, it's pretty much au naturel the entire time, the entire film. Even when the birds are attacking, you just hear this very strong fluttering, flapping noise, and all of these squawks and chirps and caws.
Yeah, the sounds of the birds in this movie is like very striking, and it's very like somewhat unnatural. Like, you could still identify it as a bird, but it's also got this unnatural menace to it, and that's very, very specific choice by Hitchcock. All the sounds in this movie, he actually has a point in his conversation with Truffaut, which I'll include a link to that interview. There's audio available online. I'll include a link to that in the blog post. But he talks about how even at one point after the mom goes to one of the men in the town's house and finds him dead, killed by birds, and she leaves, like, he even specifically engineered the car's sound to be like this cry, like this moan of terror as it revs up and drives off. And so it's like definitely the soundscape in this film is all kind of geared towards this terror that Hitchcock is building slowly at first, but then kind of just this huge release of birds literally at the end.
Yeah. And it's interesting because the birds are, in a way, the main conflict of the movie, but you can also look at it and see the birds as the catalyst for the main conflict of the movie. And the main conflict of the movie, for me, especially the second time I watched it, seemed to be the question of whether or not Tippi Hedren's character could integrate into Mitch's family. It wasn't even so much as a romance movie, because like there's an electric charge between these two. Like, it almost feels like a given that they're going to work, and their chemistry functions really well on screen. But it, especially set in this small town, in this where everybody knows everybody, there's kind of already a family dynamic going on. We already know that the school teacher has failed to integrate into the family because of the mom. And even the fact that she shows up with the lovebirds not for Mitch, but for Mitch's sister, kind of makes the question whether or not she can become part of this family. And you see her become a part of this family by the end of the movie because of the birds. And because they are forced to take all this action and fight for their lives, and the mom is forced to step back and rely on Tippi Hedren in a way that another line in the movie at some point, Tippi Hedren says that someone should tell the mother that she would be gaining a daughter. And in a way, by the end of the movie, she does.
Yeah, and at the same time, Tippi Hedren is gaining a mother, and that's another part of this dynamic is she has this conversation with Rod Taylor that her mother basically abandoned them when she was really little. So she has this hole in her life, which is the mother, and he has a mother, which is bordering on overbearing. And so, it kind of like the birds just kind of force these two pieces that already have holes in the right places to come together. But you also almost get this sense of the duality between Tippi and the school teacher, of the fact that, maybe an apocalyptic event is the only thing that was going to let another woman into this family, if you look at it from a more dark satirical point of view.
Yep. And you know what's fascinating? And I don't know how much this actually has to do with anything, but I just want to point it out. The scene where Tippi Hedren's talking about her mother in this film, her and Mitch are walking up the side of a hill carrying like a wine glass or a glass of some kind of alcohol and two other glasses, which is a scene I've seen because I watched a lot of Hitchcock movies in preparation for the series. I should preface with that. And I've seen a scene similar to that in so many Hitchcock movies. Heck, there's one in Spellbound when they go for the picnic.
Yeah, the picnic.
There's one in Suspicion where Cary Grant and Joan Fontaine are walking up a hill with a bottle of alcohol and two glasses. And I guess that's just one of those director's touches kind of things where you see the same thing pop up in every single movie. So just throwing that out there. Doesn't have much to do with the birds, but it has a lot to do with Alfred Hitchcock, and that's why we're here.
Yeah, that's interesting. So basically, if you're seeing someone or trying to see someone, just keep some glasses and a bottle of wine in your car.
Yeah, have a designated hill that you like to walk up.
Right.
Unless you live in Texas, in which case there are no hills. Sorry.
Yeah, find a nice tree stump and a cactus. But one other thing I want to talk about the just the story flow in this movie is the existence of the diner scene. Before the diner or the quote unquote downtown area is attacked, there's this scene after basically Tippi Hedren had gone to the schoolhouse just to make sure that the sister is okay. And then the schoolhouse gets attacked, and all the kids are being attacked, like really, I want to say terrifically, but in the sense that it's
good job, Birds.
Terrifying.
Doing a terrific job attacking those kids.
But after that, we have this scene where Tippi Hedren is in this diner trying to call her father and tell him, because he works for a newspaper, luckily, which actually has no bearing on anything, but she's telling him what's going on, and there's just this really long scene where Tippi Hedren is making this phone call very publicly, and all the people in the diner are like getting afraid, and some people are like, "Oh yeah, I saw this. This was weird." And this one lady's like, "Don't talk about this too much. You're scaring the kids." And it goes on for quite a long time. And actually, in the Truffaut interview, Truffaut was wondering if it maybe went on too long or not, and Hitchcock was like, "Maybe, but I really wanted to give a breath. The audience needed a breath." And it's like we were talking about last week, where you can't be on the edge of your seat for the entire movie. And right after this scene of children being attacked and bloodied by these birds, like you kind of just need a breath. And there's some comedy. There's an apocalyptic soothsayer drunk guy at the end of the bar, and an ornithologist lady who's like, "Oh, birds would never do that. They're very nice and friendly."
Yeah, there's so many know-it-alls in Hitchcock movies. It's great.
Right.
And they
usually get their comeuppance.
always have the rug pulled out from under them at some point where it turns out they're wrong. I love that.
So it's just a really good example of releasing the tension for even if it's too long, but it sets us up for the rest of the film, which is pretty straight terror. Yeah, no, it's a brilliant it's a brilliant scene. It does a lot of things that Hitchcock loves to do. Especially you mentioned all of those characters, and
we should point out that all of those storylines in the diner are happening at the same time. They overlap. It's not like one thing happens, then another thing happens, then another thing happens. Yes, more people do come into the bar, but each one just adds another thing that's going on. So the woman is asking people to not talk in front of her kids. That happens throughout the entire diner scene. The apocalyptic soothsayer happens throughout the entire diner scene. The crazy bird woman happens throughout the entire diner scene. And there's just these layers to the scene. And that's something that Hitchcock has done a lot of throughout a lot of his work. Typically, it's just one or two stories going on. Maybe one in the foreground of a shot, one in the background, which is a very great way to compose a shot and have it be very interesting and very efficient at the same time, if you want to look at it from a logistical point of view. But it also is a very fun, interesting way to have a scene go on for such a long time and have it stay kind of interesting. And also to your point about tension, Jonathan, we kind of, in a horror movie, the horror in a way relieves the tension. So we had the big build up to the schoolhouse scene where we see all these birds show up. It's a long scene with basically the only music in the entire movie when the kids are singing in the build up to the attack on the schoolhouse. And then the tension is released when the schoolhouse is attacked. We get this great scene where all this tension is being released. We're on the edge of our seat, and then we get to sit down in this diner. But over the course of the diner scene, that tension is being built up again as this town kind of gathers, almost like a flock of birds in its own right, unknowingly to be attacked by themselves, because they're all about to be attacked in a big, gory bird attack scene.
And it kind of just, to your point, one of Hitchcock's famous maxims is there's no terror in the bang, only in the anticipation of it. And that's kind of, he has several illustrations of this, but, it's just this idea that, the more you know that something terrifying is going to happen, the more terrified you are waiting for it to happen. And then when it does happen, you're maybe terrified for a couple seconds, but then, like you said, it's that release of tension because, okay, it happened. It's over. We all survived it.
Yeah. Speaking of surviving birds, let's talk about how they did the birds for a second. Because anyone who's seen a modern movie, especially those of us who have grown up today, and we're used to, from a young age, seeing, advanced CG. Anybody who grew up young enough to see the Lord of the Rings as a small child and the Matrix as a small child will not be able to fully appreciate the effects in the birds, maybe.
Which
they
this
are
film
quite
won
good for the time. But they do stick out. You can tell their effects. They're layered on top of each other. There's a lot of green screen to kind of layer, where they shot different flocks of birds and then cut out the green screen to kind of layer the birds on top of each other to make them look even thicker. There's a lot of bird puppets being used and being thrown at people on screen, and there's some that are just sewn to people, so it looks like they're attacking.
There are some real birds being thrown at people.
There are. Well, there's no real birds being thrown, but there are real trained birds. So there are trained crows. They actually had to reshoot some of the schoolhouse scene where all the kids are running away, and they built this giant treadmill with a matte painting background that would scroll through. And it took like days to reshoot the scene, but they had all these child extras running on this treadmill, and they were like throwing birds at them and having trained birds attack them. And I'm like, that sounds so traumatizing. Traumatizing for a kid.
I think there was actually some live seagulls that they were kind of throwing at the house at the end, because he has this conversation. I think this was in the American Film Institute conversation.
How does one throw a seagull? Does it cooperate?
I don't know. It was like a train, like you train it to land somewhere like inside the house, and then you kind of throw it towards the house.
Okay.
But basically they were asking, like, why didn't you use like wild seagulls or wild birds? And he was like, well, a wild bird is not very trained, so it may get halfway there and say, what the hell am I doing? And turn around and go the other way. So you have to have trained birds because they know what they're doing.
Right. You want something that can hit its mark.
Right.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
still, it is terrifying that they would use like actual birds. And I did not notice any disclaimers that said no birds were harmed in the making of this movie. So there you go.
I'd wager a bet that some of the birds are harmed in the making of this movie. There's one really great shot before the big town attack sequence where we're literally in a bird's eye view of the town way up high. And we kind of see we start to see this flock of birds form in front of us in like an attack formation. And they're
after
kind of just hovering there.
the gas guy, caught the car on fire, wasn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
You can see that streak of fire.
Yeah. It was really great. It was a great shot. Apparently the final scene, the quote climactic scene as it is described, where Tippi Hedren is attacked in a room of the house by a bunch of birds and she can't get out, and it eventually is saved by Mitch and his mom towards the end of the film, took forever to shoot. It took like a week to shoot that film, to shoot that scene. And apparently it's quite traumatizing. Tippi Hedren had to take a week or two off of like medical leave, not because she was injured, but just because straight up exhaustion. She was
like psychologically
like just burnt out. And that's one of those scenes where you constantly have to be on edge for days and days and days and days, and just emotionally just worn out, physically worn out, mentally worn out.
Not to mention having birds thrown at you.
Not to mention having things thrown at you all day. Whether or not you consented to it ahead of time doesn't make it any less exhausting to have a bunch of stuffed thrown at you the entire day. So
there's actually a BBC mini drama or series or a movie or something called The Girl, which is based on the making of that scene and how terrible it was and how awful Alfred Hitchcock was to Tippi Hedren, which there was a lot of like controversy after that came out about how bad it really was, because Tippi Hedren has alluded to some of the conduct that Alfred Hitchcock had over the course of some of the things that they made. So yeah, there's a lot of, and we can talk about that a little bit more in overall notes. There's a lot of kind of conjecture, and some people like to blow it out of proportion because it's more tabloid friendly. If Alfred Hitchcock was this terrible guy who psychologically traumatized all of his actresses, but that doesn't seem to be like a running thread throughout all of the people that he worked with. But it is, I have heard that scene was definitely very trying for Tippi Hedren especially.
Yeah. So maybe birds were hurt in the making of this movie, but some Tippi Hedrens were harmed in the making of this movie?
Yes, but not incapacitated, because the next year they collaborated again, and she gave a very different but equally compelling performance in our next movie.
Right. So let's talk about Marnie from 1964. Gosh, what to say about Marnie?
This movie's so complex.
It's really complex. It's really weird. It's hard to unpack. There's some parts of it that are either dated or just messed up. I can't tell. But
I would go with the latter, because I think there were concerns over what you're thinking about even when they were making the movie.
Okay, cool. So I'm not alone on that. Okay, good. Yeah, so anyway, let's try to unpack this. So Marnie is the story of Marnie. Wow. Okay. Anyway. Okay, so Marnie is a girl with a traumatized past, but we don't know what it is, and she certainly doesn't know what it is. She, much like Spellbound, doesn't really remember it. It's kind of repressed, but we don't know what it is. Her mother refers to it as her accident, and she still has an injured leg from whatever it is her mother does. And there's clearly some weird thing between her and her mom. Her mom treats her very strangely. And
has kind of tried to replace her, we get this sense.
Yeah. She's babysitting this kid who lives across the street. By the way, they make a very clear point in like the first time she goes to her mom's house to show in a wide shot that her house is like right by the docks, and that is really important. And I realized that the second time I watched the movie, I was like, oh yeah, you can learn a lot watching a movie the second time, especially if you're trying to pick it apart for filmmaking. I both suggest it and caution you not to overindulge in it, because you'll miss out on a lot of movies if you rewatch too many movies. Anyway, life is a limited ticking clock. Go watch the movies. Too morbid, but I do want to set up I wanted to set up that Marnie is psychologically tormented, and kind of why and what we know about it at the start of the movie. And we see that the other side of Marnie's life away from her mom, and it's clear that she spends a lot of time away from her mom, and her mom doesn't know what she's doing away from her. She thinks she's working for some millionaire as his secretary, but that's not the case. Really, Marnie is like a compulsive serial con artist / theft. She will show up at a company with a fake ID and a fake assumed identity. She'll change her hair, maybe, gain the trust of whatever company she's working at, and then rob them blind. And that's the first scene of the movie, actually. We see that the aftermath of her having robbed a company, and then we see Sean Connery come in. Who is a client of this company. He runs his own company, by the way, and we'll get to that. But he's intrigued by this woman who he's seen and he knows has robbed this company. So Marnie, compulsive thief, has a troubled past, has some issues with her mom. Sean Connery runs his own company, has heard of this serial female con artist who's been going around. Well, who should walk into Sean Connery's company the next day but Tippi Hedren as Marnie, under a new assumed name, and now she has dyed her hair blonde. So now she's the blonde that we've been waiting for.
I'm actually not sure if she dyed her hair blonde or if she got rid of a black dye and her hair is naturally blonde.
Well, I think so. In the flashback that we get to, spoiler, there's flashbacks later on that explain what happened in the past. But in the flashback we get to, I want to say her hair is blonde when she's a kid.
Yeah, because that's also the point of the kid that her mom is babysitting, who has also very blonde hair.
Yeah, she looks like Marnie as a kid. Is very much a physical stand-in for her. An emotional stand-in.
Right.
But yeah, she essentially had dark hair dye in and then lightens it up. Anyway, she starts working for the new company. She gets the job on Sean Connery's recommendation. They were going to hire somebody else, but Sean Connery shows up, sees this woman, recognizes her, and is
knows she's a thief
in like a weird way. That he kind of just wants to see what happens. Like no completely sane person hires a thief knowing they're a thief. So I just want to get this out of the way too, that Sean Connery's character is incredibly messed up over the course of this film. I don't understand 100% what his deal is. It's not like he has past trauma, but they do flesh out that he is his wife has died. He was born rich. He has remained rich. He has saved his father's company. He is interested in zoology, as he points out by his tamed jaguarundi.
Yeah, I think that's his primary character trait is big game hunter and taming
not even
wild
big game
beasts.
hunter. He's not a hunter. He just likes studying them.
Yeah,
and he
primarily wild,
says,
dangerous beasts.
Yeah, he says of his big accomplishment with his jaguarundi, which, by the way, you wouldn't even imagine how much time I spent on the jaguarundi Facebook or Wikipedia page this week. I didn't even think that was a real thing. I thought they made that up. It sounded like a made up kind of jaguar, but it is a real thing. Anyway, he says his biggest accomplishment with the jaguarundi is making it learn to trust him. And you already get at that point in the plot that that's his goal, is to make Marnie trust him in some sort of way. Anyway, as we move on, Marnie steals from the company and Sean Connery catches her, and now it is his game. He essentially has blackmail on her, and he can do what he wants with her, essentially. And as he describes it at one point, sexual blackmail, although he describes that as what other people would do to her, even though that's kind of what he's going to do to her in a way. Anyway.
Yeah, in a sense, it's really nuanced.
Yeah, so he's keeping her from being arrested. But he's also he is also trying to find out what's going on with her psychologically.
It's important to point out that he genuinely is in love with her. Even as unhealthy as it may be, he cares about her.
Yeah, he's both attracted to her and cares about her psychology. Although there is kind of this clinical aspect to him caring about her psychology, almost like he is studying a caged animal in a way.
Yeah, I just think it's important to point out that he's not just kind of being manipulative in a malicious way. There is a affection factor involved.
Yeah, he's not set up as the bad guy. We're not supposed to think he's the bad guy in the film. He does bad stuff, very bad stuff. But he's not supposed to be the bad guy. I don't know. I think part of it's kind of tone deaf. But anyway, so essentially he forces her to marry him. Oh boy. But he does nice things for her too, brings her horse over to his mansion so she can have his horse. And the rest of the film, because at this point we're about halfway through the film, is them doing this dance around each other and trying to avoid the people who are blackmailing Marnie, but also trying to get farther into Marnie's past, which Sean Connery wants to uncover because he believes it would be healthy for her. And Marnie doesn't want to uncover because she doesn't think it would be healthy for her. And we should also mention that she has a founding distrust / hatred of men that seems to have been put there by her mom, for very understandable reasons once we learn those reasons.
Yeah, but her mom is constantly saying, you're better off with no man, never get close to a man.
Yeah, no self-respecting woman would ever be with a man.
Yeah.
Anyway, she also loves horses. That's just an interesting character trait throughout the film. It leads to some interesting emotional moments once they get to the hunt. And she also is terrified of the color red, which I'm sure you can all guess why red is the motif. It's kind of self-explanatory, but there is a huge red motif, and whenever she sees red, she kind of freaks out. It literally triggers her in the way that good old Gregory Peck is triggered by parallel lines and the color white in Spellbound.
Yeah, and that's something that I really want to get into, is this parallel between Marnie and Spellbound in kind of a reverse way, where the woman is the one that has this psychological trauma that has to be uncovered in order to basically unpack it. Except in this film, she's not as innocent as Gregory Peck was. And there's a lot of layers to that too. But yeah, the idea that red triggers her the way that white triggered Gregory Peck, and also she has these nightmares that are triggered by this tapping, any kind of tapping sound,
essentially
while
knock
she's
on the
asleep.
door.
Yeah, and that's kind of similar to anytime Gregory Peck sees these parallel lines in some way. And it also, like you were saying, Sean Connery fills this role almost of the psychologist, where he doesn't know, he's not a psychologist. He knows about dangerous animals and large game and stuff like that. But he literally at some point picks up a book about what's it called? Sexual perversions in the criminal female or something like that. And so he becomes this analyst for her, and he fulfills the same role that Ingrid Bergman did in Spellbound, trying to help her by figuring out what happened that she doesn't remember, but in less of a wrap of literal psychology, which actually makes it more interesting. The fact that they're not constantly bringing up the guilt complex and all these other like jargony things that I don't care about because they're too busy, dealing with literal personal issues.
And talking about Jaguar Rundies. I'm kidding. That only happens once in the film.
That happens one time. So yeah, it's really interesting that it's almost a remake of Spellbound in certain instances, and I think he delves into a lot. He makes it a lot more fleshed out and a lot deeper than Spellbound was.
Yeah, for sure. And we do have to get this. We have to cover this, get it out of the way, I guess. But the character dynamic between the two leads in this film is not nearly as healthy as the character dynamic between the two leads in Spellbound. And I don't think we're supposed to come away from Marnie thinking these people are like good people. But I do think we're supposed to be working towards this resolution at the end, where Marnie's past is revealed and suddenly we understand her as a character. Because that's like the strain that that's put upon us as an audience as we watch the movies, that we're struggling to understand this person who seemingly steals for no significant reason. I mean, she uses the money to buy her mom stuff, but in a search quest for her mother's love, which she doesn't believe she has. But even then, like the amount that she's stealing and the lifestyle she lives and the compulsive lies she tells all lead up to this very interesting like enigma wrapped in a mystery that we want to understand and desperately want to understand in the same way that Sean Connery's character wants to understand her. And so we go along with this movie because we want to understand this character, and we finally get that at the end. We finally get that catharsis. But along the way, Sean Connery's interest in her is at times very helpful to her and at times very unhealthy. And what I'm referring to when I talk about Sean Connery's character, Mark Rutland, doing some not good, very bad things throughout the movie. There's one scene, very controversial scene in the film, during their honeymoon after they're essentially forced to marriage, where Mark Rutland forces himself upon his now wife after she's kind of essentially shut down after being triggered by, I think, red, maybe something else at that point. I don't know. Anyway,
I think at that point she was just upset that his reading light was on.
I think she was upset that. Oh no, I remember what happened. She shut down after he made a move on her.
Right.
And yeah, right. Okay.
But
anyway,
before, there wasn't any of the flashback stuff in play.
There wasn't any flashback stuff in that scene. Anyway, it was a very controversial scene. It was even so controversial that there were some issues with the writer, I believe. And as to whether or not this scene holds up, I'm gonna say no. It's weird, it's bad, and it seems like an odd thing to put in there for a character that we are ostensibly supposed to like, to essentially rape his wife, who didn't even fully consent to be his wife in the first place. Now, if you're looking for a portrait of very complicated characters that you're not supposed to like, but you find very interesting, then I think, yes, then in that case it works. But the rest of the movie, it feels like we're supposed to like Mark Rutland, except for this scene. Anyway, that's my opinion on it, is that I don't think it works in the movie anymore. I don't even know if it worked at the time being, but that's my take on it.
Yeah, and like you said, like it kind of feels tone deaf, like it's just of a different time. But even like you said, the original writer on the film really didn't like that scene, and he kind of wrote it both ways. And Hitchcock fired him for it to keep it in there. So it's like, it's not that they didn't realize the issues with the scene.
Didn't think it worked.
It's just that I don't I don't know. Hitchcock felt that it was important for the character dynamics, and maybe you'll have to just fast forward in 2 weeks when we talk about anti-heroes and throw this in that category.
Yeah. Of course, Mark Rutland isn't the lead of the film. Tippi Hedren is the lead of the film. And she is a very complex, fascinating character who has so much psychological stuff to unpack that is literally the interesting driving force of the film, is unpacking her psychological baggage.
And it's so different from her character in The Birds, who started off very poised and very, high society and all this, and then just kind of comes down to a human level. And in this film, she comes in with this facade, this, she's a thief, but she's really good at playing roles to get people to like her and put her in their confidence, so that she can steal from them. So we know from very early on that she has these psychological issues, and the whole film, we just keep going down this rabbit hole and it just deconstructing her every step of the way. But there are some very similar character dynamics to The Birds, where we have a brunette, quote unquote, rival character who we haven't mentioned yet. Her name is Lil, and she is she's Sean Connery's sister-in-law. His first wife has died, and her sister wants him, basically. And so she plays it very cool a lot of times, but then she also does things that are very deliberate to get Marnie out of the way, like inviting one of the guys that she robbed previously to a party, and that really messes Marnie up. And so it's a really interesting dynamic where she's very sweet on the outside, but she does these really manipulative things. And our mother character, we have two characters who are missing a parent. Sean Connery doesn't have a mother, and Marnie does have a mother. But as opposed to the almost overbearing and over affectionate mother in The Birds, we have kind of the opposite and a very messed up mother character in this film. And I don't know how specific we want to be, because that's very, very much spoiler territory. So maybe we just give our spoiler warning here. And just give a couple seconds, and then we'll talk a little bit about the ending before we go to overall.
Cool. Spoiler in 1, 2, 3. Jonathan?
So by the end of the film, we come back to the mother's house, because we've been learning throughout the film that the mother is the cause of everything that's wrong with Marnie. And we kind of get that idea. Or she
knows the cause of everything.
Or she knows. Right. So Sean Connery has basically figured it all out by the time that they go there. And he's just there. He's figured it mostly out. And he goes there to confront the mother, to tell Marnie, so that Marnie will understand what's wrong with her, basically. And we find out that her mother was a call girl for the sailors that would come into this port. As you mentioned, Alex, we make very clear that we know that we are right by a harbor. And so they lived in this little tiny apartment. And anytime that a man would come by, Marnie would have to get out of bed and go sleep on the couch.
That would be the knocking, by the way. The knocking sound that she's scared of is the knock on the door that would signal her mother has a customer. She needs to get out of bed, and she needs to go sleep in the cold living room.
Yeah, and at some point, one of the sailors comes out because she was crying, afraid of this storm that's going on, and he gets a little too close to her, and then her mother pulls him off and starts tussling with him, and they fall over, and that's what hurts her mom's leg. And then Marnie sees that her mother's in trouble, and she picks up the fire poker and kills the sailor with it, and she's like 8 or 9 at this point. So her mother takes the fall for it and says that it's self-defense, so no one ends up going to jail, but it's so traumatic that Marnie suppresses it, and that's why she's afraid of red, because the sailor's white uniform was just covered in red, and storms and all these other things, dreams, because she was asleep when it all happened, and her mother just feels like she failed, but then when she realizes that Marnie's memory doesn't remember it, She tries to be better, but still you feel like there's definitely this distance between her daughter, and she kind of uses the neighbor's daughter as kind of like a starting over point. So yeah, there's so much that goes on and is all revealed at the end, and it's really complicated and dark even for a Hitchcock film.
Yeah. That last scene is a hard one. It's a hard movie.
Yeah, it is.
It's a hard movie to get through. It's not an easy one. No one comes out the other side looking rosy colored or innocent or good, but they somehow make it through to the other side, and it almost the end shot almost feels like the moment after the storm, once the storm has passed and everything's wet and soaked, but the sun has finally come out, and maybe the characters have a chance at living something approaching a good life now, but we don't know for sure. But like we said, there's other parts of the movie that feel incredibly tone deaf and out of sync with what you would expect of these characters, or what you'd want to expect of these characters. And correct me if I'm wrong, Jonathan, but this is kind of like the end of Hitchcock's peak years.
Yeah, so this comes out right after The Birds, which was incredibly well received, still considered a classic. And Marnie was not as well received. And some of the speculation about that is, even though some people look back on it as a classic, it does have a lot of very Hitchcockian scenes and builds and stuff. But the thing is that a lot of peak Hitchcock movies, you can feel the filmmaking in them. So like you're saying, that establishing shot with the boat and the harbor, you can tell it's a matte painting. You can tell that we're doing a screen process when we're driving cars. It's this very almost theatrical way of making movies that Hitchcock built his career on. But by this point in the coming up to the late 60s, filmmaking has become more and more realistic, and cinema verite is coming along, and we're able to get our cameras out to locations and stuff like that. But Hitchcock was very much a studio director, and so that's one of the things that maybe is why his later films are not as well regarded, is because they don't feel like they've kept up with the other films that were coming out at the time. They were kind of, at some point, they all felt like they were from a very different period of Hollywood history.
Yeah, and he would eventually leave off in his prolificness leading up to that point, where he would release movie year after year after year, to where there would be more space as you get into the 70s, and then I think one in the 80s, and then that was about it. Around this time, I think he also started to focus on his TV presence a bit more, where he could still do some of his old suspense work, or at least propagate his old suspense style done by other people in his show Alfred Hitchcock Presents. But the studio system that he had kind of been so successful in was crumbling at this point, and it was hard for him to be as prolific as he once was. But
and
anyway,
there's also, one real quick thing. One of the things that I was reading, I don't exactly remember where, but someone was talking about how Hitchcock's just physical presence kind of dictated the kind of director that he was. He was not a nimble man. And so, if you see like behind the scenes footage of George Lucas or Steven Spielberg on Raiders of the Lost Ark and Star Wars, they're like all over the place, hopping all over the set, like in the boats of Jaws and stuff like that. But Alfred Hitchcock was very much more confined to where he was. And so being in a studio and a very controlled environment is definitely his forte, and it's just different from the kinds of films that has started coming out near the end of his career. All right, so overall notes, and the first thing we should probably talk about, just because we're dealing a lot with women in film again, is the Bechdel test. And for those who don't remember, back in our conversation about Nancy Meyers with AJ, that is this kind of just test of, it's kind of a very broad general test to show how fleshed out your female characters are versus your male characters. And the little criteria is if two female characters who both have names in the script have a conversation together about something that is not a man.
Which is really, it sounds like a super low bar, but you'd be shocked how many films just don't pass it.
Yeah. And even these films, like they don't, I mean, there's not a whole lot of conversation, but some of them do pass. Spellbound probably does not pass because there are just not a lot of female characters in general. It's just a lot of male characters and Ingrid Bergman. But I think The Birds does pass. There's a long conversation again between Tippi Hedren and the school teacher, and they're talking about Rod Taylor's mom, and they're talking.
And the school teacher's passed.
And Tippi Hedren talks with Rod Taylor's sister, and they talk about birds and coming to the birthday party and stuff like that. So there's a lot of interaction between the females in that just movie in general. And then Marnie also has a lot of conversation between Marnie and her mom about the little girl down the street and stuff like that. So I think that one has some pretty solid instances of just female conversation. Probably between Marnie and Lil too.
Yeah, which again, very low bar. And it doesn't say a lot to whether or not those female characters are well built or well represented, but it is a nice check mark, and it's kind of become a notorious standard for testing the presence of female characters in movies. So it is an interesting thing to look at.
Especially since we're talking about films who are led by women. It's just interesting to make sure that they actually, pass the industry's low standard for female characters. Which
I'm really shocked that Spellbound doesn't pass, because especially considering how strong of a character Ingrid Bergman's character is in that movie. She falls in love, but not in a super girlish way that you typically see in 1940s films even. In kind of this strong way, maybe misguided because that's part of the plot, but she's a very strong female character, but still there just, like you said, there just aren't many women in that film. So
yeah. But there's also two other women that are not, actually one of them is in a couple of his films, but that had a big influence on Hitchcock's life, and that is his wife Alma and his daughter Patricia. And as we mentioned last week, Alma had a really big impact on his career just because she came from the industry and was a huge supporter of him throughout all of his films and gave him advice. They
collaborated a lot, especially early in his career.
Yeah, he would always show his films to his wife and make sure that she approved them and get input from her. I think there's actually a story where in the famous shower scene in Psycho at the end, she swallows, and Alma noticed it and no one else did. And so then they had to go and cut that out so that she would really look dead. And Patricia was actually in Psycho and a couple other films. And, she was a big part of his life, and still is kind of carried on his legacy by, helping collaborate with books and just she's been very forthcoming as far as giving information about her father.
She wrote the introduction to the Alfred Hitchcock Piece by Piece book, which is the impetus for this whole entire series that we're doing on Alfred Hitchcock.
Right. Again, and I'll keep a note for that in there. But there are also some not so great interactions with women that we've already alluded to. Most specifically with Tippi Hedren, I haven't heard of any other stories. A couple or several years ago now, I think Tippi Hedren released an autobiography, and she related information about it, about misconduct by Alfred Hitchcock on sets of The Birds and Marnie. But again, there's kind of pretty much everyone else who worked with Hitchcock basically said that he was really good to work with. But there are some other instances of kind of the Stanley Kubrick effect. Like we talked about how he would in order to get the right performance, he would basically be not a nice person to his actors. And there was another quick story in that piece by piece book of how he would basically cold shoulder the girl who played Lil in Marnie in order to give her that cold, kind of calculating persona as she tries to get Sean Connery from Marnie.
Yeah. So it sounds like it might not be the best way to build relationships and make friends. And maybe it's not even ethically correct, especially some of the ways that Stanley Kubrick would do it. But it has led to some great performances. So I don't know. Take the good and shun the bad, maybe.
Yeah, just I think the goal is to find a way to get the right performance while also being a good person. Like, they can't be that hard. Actors act for a reason. They don't have to, literally be feeling completely shunned and isolated inside when they perform. They're able to channel that from other points in their life. They don't need to be feeling it on set necessarily. So,
yeah.
Anyway, as we've said, women are going to play a really big role in the other films that we're going to talk about. Some of those most famous films are famous because of the way that women interact with the male characters in the film. Specifically, we're going to talk about in a couple weeks Vertigo, where, a whole big chunk of the premise is a man recreating a woman into the image of a different woman in his mind, and Psycho about
oh boy, we're going to get into some psychology there.
Yeah, about, the controlling mother gone pushed all the way to 11. And so that is going to be really interesting. It's good that we're having this conversation early because elements of this conversation are going to recur, like I said, in probably every other one of these episodes that we do.
Yeah. And if you're wondering why we're talking about all of these messed up relationships between men and women, well, it's because they're the interesting things to put in movies. That's why. That's what makes Psycho and Vertigo and Spellbound and Marnie and all of these films interesting, is the way they interact between these two gender roles, and seeing how they interact in not healthy ways. If they're interacting healthily, it would not make for an interesting movie. It would make for a very boring movie. Except maybe one of the movies that we're going to talk about next week, where all of the people are kind of good people, maybe a little messed up. I don't know. You'll see if you once you watch it.
And a little thing that I like to throw in here sometimes are other things that I think about when I'm watching the movies that we're talking about. And so I had a couple this week that I just want to kind of throw out there just for fun. Two that relate to the birds, because there is a Black Mirror episode, I believe it's the last episode of season 3, called Hated in the Nation, which is probably as close to a modern remake of The Birds as you can get. Like,
it's the bees.
It's the bees. Like, if I ever thought about someone remaking The Birds, I would say that there's no way you could do it. But Hated in the Nation kind of does it, and kind of does it really well, throwing in this element of government surveillance and the detrimental power of social media all wrapped up into this big bundle. And on the flip side of how to remake The Birds, you have Birdemic, which, if you can get your hands on it, watch it with friends, otherwise you'll hate your life. But it is a tragedy. It's one of those so bad it's good movies.
Kind of like The Room.
Yeah, it's people trying to make a really honest kind of memento to the birds and failing miserably and hilariously. And finally, kind of in relation to Marnie, since it's me, I have to throw in a Twilight Zone reference. And that is an episode called Nightmare as a Child from the first season, episode 29, about a woman who sees this little girl who keeps giving her warnings, and it turns into some suppressed memories and stuff that very ties into the themes of Marnie, like we've been talking about.
Right. And next time on the Filmlings, we're going to be talking about Alfred Hitchcock's anti-heroes. And our first movie is kind of an interesting take on that idea, and we'll be getting into that next week, but it's an interesting one to watch. It's a Hitchcock comedy, The Trouble with Harry from 1955. Also coming out the same year is Cary Grant in To Catch a Thief from 1955. And then last but not least...
Definitely not least. I think maybe Jonathan's favorite movie. I don't know. Sometimes it shifts. But Vertigo from 1958 with Jimmy Stewart. Yeah, so anti-heroes, as we kind of alluded to with Marnie, they are characters that they're the protagonists of the film. We're following them, but they don't always make good decisions. And so the audience is left with this conflicted feeling of, am I rooting for him? They don't always make
heroic decisions.
Right, yeah. So they'll make morally questionable decisions, and you have to kind of... the audience starts struggling with themselves on whether they're supposed to be rooting for this person or not. So we're going to get into lots of that next week.
Yeah, and if you're wondering if you're wondering what a heroic decision is, this is the shorthand test that I always use. Is it something that George Bailey would do? If it is something that George Bailey would do, it is the heroic thing to do. If it is not something George Bailey would do, it is not the heroic thing to do. I think that him as a protagonist is like the epitome of a protagonist routinely making heroic decisions. Decisions that might be detrimental to themselves, but are the right thing to do.
That's a pretty good test. And I think if you wanted to throw up like a scale, you could just put Jimmy Stewart from Vertigo on one end and Jimmy Stewart from It's a Wonderful Life on the other end. And there you have your hero to anti-hero spectrum. Yeah.
It'll be a very interesting week to talk about anti-heroes. It's still a concept that's a little vague and fuzzy. And of course, judging by the movies we picked out, it'll still be a little vague and fuzzy. It's not like we're going to solve any of those problems. But it'll be fun to talk about. It'll be fun to watch more Hitchcock. And it'll be fun to dive into what makes these 3 particular movies so great. But with that, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at @JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Garinger.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya.
The rest of this podcast will be in bird noises only. Tweet, 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 tweet.
Tweet, tweet.
Ah. Oh, so insightful.